Hello, YouTube. Um, so let's soldier on in Hegel. I'm going to try and get through paragraphs 13 to 21. We'll see how long this video turns out to be, though. There are two distinct points he makes in that time, and I thought about splitting them into two videos, but since it's kind of like a point-counterpoint thing, I think it might be better to stick to one video. First paragraph 13. Paragraph 13 probably should have been in the previous video. He discusses, we were talking about the old shape of spirit shifting into a new shape of spirit, right? And everything breaks and everything sort of shifts, but it's not fully articulated yet. So at this moment, when this shift happens, he says the wealth of previous experience is still present to consciousness in memory, right? So spirit remembers the previous form that it takes on. This shift doesn't erase that. Further, he says, consciousness misses, in the newly emerging shape, its former range and specificity of content, and even more the articulation of form, whereby distinctions are securely defined and stand arrayed in their fixed relations. Right? So, the example that I brought up was Tsarism shifting to Soviet Russia. When Tsarism was in place, right? You can imagine a whole series of, okay, the king, or the czar rather, serves this function. This person serves this, holds this office, serves this function, blah, 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 blah. So you have this whole official apparatus of distinctions and differentiations that are sort of the lifeblood of how it functions. But further, it's not just the official apparatus. There's also an underneath apparatus. So if some shady priest wants a prostitute, for instance, who does he go to, right? So like that whole underworld is also fully articulated. This is what a fully articulated society looks like. When that society collapses, those articulations don't exist anymore, and so everything becomes very difficult to maneuver, right? Things aren't as fixed. Things aren't fixed anymore, so life becomes difficult. So consciousness misses that, right? It misses a fully articulated, differentiated world. So it strives to push forward into that. This is where the teleology of Hegel's system sort of starts to come in, right? Everything breaks down. We have a shift, and then that shift longs for a fully articulated form, so it begins to progress. And then eventually, as it progresses out, those distinctions, when it goes to the end, those distinctions become untenable, and the same thing happens. And so you get this cycle. this is essential for Hegel's philosophy. Then he goes on to say, without such articulations, science, and mind you, when he talks about science, he's talking about systematic philosophy. Without those articulations, science lacks universal intelligibility and seems esoteric. Whereas the highest form of science should be able to be understood by all, right? Which is ironic for Hegel, given how esoteric his philosophy could get. So the highest form of science is comprehensible to everybody. And the reason why is because it's diffused out into the world. So we could think maybe when Darwin posed evolution by natural selection, that may well have seemed esoteric, that may well have seen something like it's reserved for a select few of people. But as it becomes more articulated, and over time, as there are sort of pop scientists who go about the noble work of explaining what's happening to people, it becomes sort of common knowledge. And for Hegel, this is the highest point that a science can reach. Now, we go into paragraph 14. And paragraphs 14 through 16 are a critique. And this is one of the reasons why Hegel can be so difficult, is that he doesn't explicitly mention what he's critiquing by name. But I think what he's driving at, he's critiquing Fichte and Schelling and the Romantics, the post-Kantian transcendental idealists, and the idea that he is critiquing very specifically is found actually in paragraph 16. So I'm going to read that sentence and go back. The idea is, dealing with something from the perspective of the absolute consists merely in declaring that, although one has been speaking of it just now as something definite, yet in the absolute the A equals A. There is nothing of the kind, for there all is one. Right? This is the idea that Hegel finds unsatisfying, or not fully fleshed out, right? The idea that in the absolute everything is self-identical and complete unto itself. And the world, because its mere appearance is something that's articulated and defined, right? So this tells you something about Hegel's attitude towards God, too. Because traditionally, God is, if we say that there's some relationship between God and the absolute, which I don't think is a controversial statement, traditionally God is looked at as simple, right? As something that is without parts. Hegel seems to want to reject that idea. He comes back to God in a minute for, quite specifically. But that simplicity is not, it's not sufficient for Hegel. So in the absolute, all is one, right? That's the idea he's critiquing. And at 14 he says, science, and he's really talking matic philosophy, in its early stages, when it has attained neither the completeness of detail nor perfection of form, is vulnerable to criticism. But it would be as unjust for such criticism to strike at the very heart of science as it is untenable to refuse to honor the demand for its further development. Right, so someone poses a systematic philosophy, it's not fully fleshed out, so it's vulnerable to criticism. And in fact, it needs criticism. Criticism is a good thing. Criticism allows you to further refine the thing. But it would be unjust for criticism to remove the impulse to posit things at all. Right? So, you can criticize a philosophy, but what's unjust is to criticize philosophy itself. Right? I think that's what he's getting at. And it is untenable to refuse the demand for its further development. Right. This polarization seems to be the Gordian knot with which scientific culture is at present struggling, and which it still does not properly understand. One side, so here we get the beginnings of a dialectic. One side boasts of its wealth of material and intelligibility. That's science. And I'm going to use that word science for systematic philosophy, just for brevity's sake. One side boasts of its wealth of material and intelligibility, science. The other side at least scorns this intelligibility and flaunts its immediate rationality and divinity. Right. The other side are the romantics, Schelling, Fichte, and the people who say, in the absolute, all is one. Right. Flaunts its immediate rationality and divinity. So this is a divine conception, and it's something that's very easy to sort of understand. I think we see a lot of this reasoning nowadays in like New Age thinking, right? The notion that we're all one, really. You know, the fact that we're differentiated is just an appearance or something. So, these are the two sides he sets up. If the former side, science, is reduced to silence, whether it be by the force of truth alone, or by the blustering of the other, and even if, in respect of fundamentals, it feels itself outmatched, it is by no means satisfied regarding the said demands. Right? So even if these romantics sort of intimidate science with how well they've thought things out, science can't be, or systematic philosophy can't be suppressed like that. For said demands are justified but not fulfilled. So there's a need to continue. There's a need to further the project. Its silence stems only half from the triumph of its opponent, and half from the boredom and indifference which tend to result from the continual awakening of expectations through unfulfilled promises. This is important. So for Hegel, the history of systematic philosophy entails the continual awakening of expectation, unfulfilled promises, right? For Hegel, the history of systematic philosophy is a series of failures. But nonetheless, it will continue. There's something about it that we need to continue. Kant makes a similar point, actually. So yeah, paragraph 15. As for the content, the other side, being the romantics, make it easy enough for them at times to display a great expanse of it. They appropriate a lot of already familiar and well-ordered material. By focusing on rare and exotic instances, they give the impression that they have a hold of everything else, which scientific knowledge had already embraced in its scope, and that they are also in command of such material as yet unordered. It thus appears that everything has been subjected to the absolute idea. That's, again, the absolute. In the absolute, everything is one, right? It thus appears that everything has been subjected to the absolute idea, idea, which therefore seems to be cognized in everything and to have matured into an expanded science. So he's saying that Fichte and Schelling and their schools, they do a good job of making themselves look really scientific. They do a good job of making themselves seem like they have a lot to say. And then he says, I'm trying to distill this next series of sentences into a more succinct way. He says that, okay, we have this absolute idea, and you're taking that and applying it to all sorts of stuff. Okay, right? But the trouble is, absolute idea being applied to the thing, right? And this doesn't change, and it applies to any number of these, right? What Hegel wants to say is that this isn't sufficient because the absolute idea, doesn't change as well, right? Like, because the absolute idea does not develop. So therefore, he says, the idea, which is capital I, which is, of course, true enough on its own account, remains in effect always in its primitive condition, if its development involves nothing more than this sort of repetition of the same formula. Right? So this idea doesn't move. That's the weakness that Hegel's pointing out. And then he goes on. Paragraph 16. Nowadays we see all value ascribed to the universal idea in this non-actual form, and the undoing of all distinct entities is allowed to pass muster as the speculative mode of treatment. And then he says, the sentence that I quoted before, dealing with something from the perspective of the absolute consists merely in declaring that, although one has been speaking of it just now as something definite, yet in the absolute the A equals A where there is nothing of the kind, for there all is one. Right? Then he goes on to pit this single insight that in the absolute everything is the same against the full body of articulated cognition, which at least seeks and demands such fulfillment, is to palm off its absolute as the night in which, as the saying goes, all cows are black. This is cognition naively reduced to vacuity. So the point is that, okay, that's your absolute, but that absolute is stupid, right? It's vacuous. It's not substantial. It doesn't mean it. It doesn't get us anywhere. Okay, so that's quick capsule review of Hegel's critique of Fichte and Schelling. Now, I'm not a Fichte and Schelling expert, right? So I can't go into these things, nor am I a Hegel expert, by the way. I might very well be giving what a Hegelian would call a stupid reading of Hegel. That might be the case. So if somebody knows more about Hegel than I do, please pipe up and tell me all the reasons why I'm wrong. But then he presents, let's move on. So in paragraphs 14 to 16, he presents a critique of Fichte and Schelling. And then in 17, we begin with the statement, in my view, right? So he's going to provide a contrapositive claim. This is where Hegel gets really interesting. This is where I would theoretically break the video. Am I going to break the video? Yeah, this is 20 minutes long. So I'll cap it there. That was Hegel's critique of Fichte, Schelling, and the Romantics. Have a good day.